The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Now a man was ill, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who had anointed the Lord with perfumed oil and dried his feet with her hair. It was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, saying, "Master, the one you love is ill." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness is not to end in death, but it is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he remained for 2 days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you want to go back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If one walks during the day, he does not stumble, but he sees the light of this world. But if one walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." He said this and then told them, "Our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I am going to awaken him." So the disciples said to him, "Master, if he is asleep, he will be saved." But Jesus was talking about his death, while they thought that he meant ordinary sleep. So then Jesus said to them clearly, "Lazarus has died, and I am glad for you that I was not there, that you may believe. Let us go to him." So Thomas, called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us go also and die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, only about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary sat at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have come to believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary secretly, saying, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." As soon as she heard this, she rose quickly and went to him. For Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still where Martha had met him. So when the Jews who were with her in the house, comforting her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her, presuming that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled, and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Sir, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died?" So Jesus, perturbed again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay across it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, "Lord, by now there will be a stench. He has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd here, I have said this, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, tied hand and foot with burial bands, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. So Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Now many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen what he had done began to believe in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Good morning, everyone. How many of you are familiar with the Catholic publication called Our Sunday Visitor? I'm shocked. I've asked people at all the masses and only a few people raise their hands. If you've got some extra change laying around, buy yourself a subscription to Our Sunday Visitor. It's very inexpensive. It's a Catholic newspaper, a weekly that comes out. And it's very delightful read. It has a lot of information, a lot of nice news stories as well. Well, anyway, I was sifting through my Sunday Visitor a number of years ago, and I came across an article that you may not recall, but it was in international news for a long period of time, that happened back in the year 1985. And what happened was a journalist by the name of Terry Anderson and a Catholic priest by the name of Father Martin Jinko were kidnapped by a group of Islamic fundamentalist terrorists in Lebanon and held hostage for 18 months. And so the story about Father Jinko and his faith and all that sort of thing was in this particular issue, and it was a very interesting read. Well, I thought to myself, you know, it would be nice if he could come to Wheeling and give a talk, maybe at the Masses sometime. And so the parish where he was located as the associate pastor was listed, of course no phone number or address, but I went to the National Catholic Directory and found the place, and I thought I'd give him a call. So I called, and lo and behold, he answered the phone. And I said, "Well, Father," I said, "I'm here in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I'm fascinated with your story, and I just wondered if I could probably persuade you to come to give a talk at some point in time." He said, "Well, when would you like me to come?" And I said, "Well, Advent's about 6 months away. How about kicking off our Advent season?" And he went and checked his calendar, and he said, "Sure, I'd be glad to come." And I thought, wow, that was easy. So when the day came for me to pick him up at the airport in Pittsburgh, which is only about 40 minutes away, I'd gotten a call right before I left to go to the airport from a woman who told me about a couple whose little 5-year-old boy named Joel was dying as a result of acute leukemia. The family did not want to call me because they were embarrassed. They'd been away from the church for a number of years. But this woman who cared a lot about the parents said, if you could just go and pray with them and anoint Joel, it would mean a whole lot to them. And so I was faced with a little dilemma. Do I go take care of Joel first, or do I go to the airport in Pittsburgh? And so I decided to go on and pick up Father Jinko first. And on our trip back to the Wheeling area, I told him, I said, you know, we've got two options here. Either I can take you right straight to the rectory, the house where I live, or we can go, if you want to come with me, and I'll anoint little Joel. And he said, no, I want to go with you. And so we went to a part of Wheeling called Wheeling Island, which is a rather rundown place. And we went to the address, and it was the Advent season. People already had their Christmas decorations up. And so I rang the doorbell, and two of the most grief-stricken looking people answered the door, the mother and the father. And I introduced myself, and I said, I've come to anoint and pray with Joel. And so they led us into their living room, where there was a large bed there, a queen-size bed at least. There was Christmas tree and decorations all around, but the thing that just caught my eye was Joel lying right in the middle of the bed. He had his blanket right up to his neck. There was no hair at all on his head as a result of whatever treatment he had had for this acute leukemia. And it was very clear that he was in a coma. He was dying. And when I turned around and looked for Father Jinko, what I saw just amazed me. He got on both of his knees, he lowered his head, and he was sobbing. And I thought that was a bit of an unusual reaction because, you see, we priests see a lot of death. We see death in infants, we see death in elderly people. But what particularly struck me was his reaction in light of the fact of what this man had gone through in his life, especially being held captive in Lebanon. And so we anointed Joel, we prayed over him, and then we left, and Joel died a few days later. But the evening that Father Jinko arrived, we went to a place to get a bite to eat because I had questions for him, and the typical questions. What was it like being held hostage and all that? And he was very frank and open about it. He had no hesitation in talking, but he had told me that it was the most horrific experience he could ever imagine anyone going through. He said they held he and Terry Anderson hostage for a total of 18 months until President Reagan negotiated their release. And he said every day, sometimes several times a day, the terrorists would beat them. They were constantly threatening their lives. He talked about a time when they had him tied and they were laying, and they laid him back on the floor. So they looked up at the ceiling, and he said someone went up to the rafter and made a noose out of a chain, and they were laughing and telling them, that they were going to hang him in just a short bit. And then they left him there to wallow in their fear and worry. They would take guns up to their heads and cock them and make a cocking sound as though they were going to shoot them. They would beat them many times with the butts of the guns. But he told me the worst thing they did to him and Terry Anderson was they wrapped their bodies completely in duct tape. And he said, Father, you just don't know what it's like in the dead part of summer in Lebanon when your body is wrapped in duct tape. The only opening they had was for their mouths. He said it was like being in hell. And so all of this went on, and so I said, well, how did you get through it all? How did you get through it? And he said, well, I got angry with God at first. He said, I told God, my name is Marty. It's not Job. He said, why do you treat me like Job? I'm not Job. And then he told me when it became inevitable that death could happen at any moment in his life. That's when the words of today's gospel, which I just proclaimed, made sense. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though he should die, will live forever. And so for Father Jinko, whether it be praying over a dying little boy named Joel, or being tortured by terrorists in Lebanon, whatever the case may be, he told me that he lost fear of death. Fear of death left him once and for all. And he believed for the first time in his life that the worst thing that could happen to him, death, no longer had power over him because Jesus was in control. That statement, his description of it, and I'm not doing it service, really did a lot to shore up my faith. And that brings us to our gospel today. A very beautiful and powerful story, as only John could write in his gospel. But some interesting little details. Jesus is a number of miles away from a city called Bethany, where his dear friend Lazarus and Lazarus' sisters Martha and Mary are dwelling. We hear about Martha and Mary in Luke chapter 10 about their being sisters, but we really don't hear about Lazarus in the other Gospels, with the exception of Luke chapter 16, where we're told there was a poor beggar named Lazarus. But this is not the same Lazarus. But isn't it interesting? In Hebrew, the name Lazarus means God saves. Isn't it interesting? So there they are when Jesus receives word from the sisters of Lazarus that Lazarus has taken seriously ill. But notice what happens. Jesus doesn't move. He stays right there. He doesn't go anywhere. Now the disciples, who are always misunderstanding Jesus, it seems, think it's because there are Jews located there who have been trying to kill Jesus. And maybe that's why he's reluctant to go there to do something about his friend Lazarus. But we're told he does not budge. And so finally they receive word that Lazarus is dead. And so some of them begin to say, well, you know, if he opened the eyes of the man born blind, why couldn't he go and heal Lazarus? He's healed other people before. Jesus' response, the reason we did not go was so that you may believe. You see, what Jesus is going to do is allow his friend Lazarus to die. Because what's going to happen through this death is not finality. As Jesus will say, so that God's glory can be revealed. If you remember in John chapter 9, the gospel we heard last week, when Jesus healed the man born blind, one of the people says to Jesus, was he born that way because of some sin he committed or one that his parents committed? Jesus says neither. It was so that the glory of God could be revealed. For Jesus, the most horrible things that could happen to us in this life are opportunities for God's power to be revealed, you see. And so Jesus is going to work through these desperate situations to show us who really is in control. And so when he makes his way to Bethany, he encounters first Martha and then her sister Mary. And they both give him something of a polite chiding. They say to him, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. They're grief-stricken because of this. And when Martha says it, Jesus simply says, well, he's not going to die. He's going to rise. And she says something that some Jews in the day would have said as well. She says to Jesus, well, I know he will rise in the resurrection at the end of time. You see, the majority of Jews at the time that Jesus was here on earth did not believe in a resurrection. When you died, they put you in the ground, and that was it. That was the end of the story. You were gone, dead and gone. But a small group of the Jews, the Pharisee party, actually believed that there would be a resurrection, and they believed, however, it would happen at the end of time, and everybody would be raised at the same time, automatically. So the thought of one man being raised from the dead did not fit into their belief system. But look what Jesus does. He asks where Lazarus has been buried. They take him to the tomb, and notice what happens. We're told that Jesus weeps, and then in verse 33 of this passage, we see something that speaks volume. For years I have tackled this passage, trying to make sense of the Greek verbs that are used to translate, because the translation that we have here is very weak from the Greek. It says that Jesus was perturbed and filled with deep emotions. It's like saying me having type A influenza, my nose tickles a little bit. That just doesn't get it for what I'm going through. My fever, my everything that I'm experiencing if I'm having the flu. No, it's much deeper than that. So what does this passage really translate to in English? Two verbs. The first verb translates as filled with the deepest of emotions. You see, the Greeks believed that the emotions came from your bowels, the depths of the human person. And so when you had deep emotions, it's a way of saying your entire body is involved in this. And maybe you've been upset to the point that you feel like your whole body is involved in that upset. Well, that's one part of the equation for Jesus. But the other verb, terase, translates into English as to shudder, to shudder. And so picture Jesus. He's looking at this tomb with a stone rolled over top of it. And the stone connotes finality. It's a done deal. Jesus cries at first, and then he shudders with emotion. People have said to me, well, what emotion was he feeling? Something beyond anger, way beyond anger. And here's the best way to describe it. As I shared with you the first Sunday of Lent, when we heard the temptation scene in the desert in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 4, I shared with you that Matthew, Mark, and Luke only have temptation accounts. It's not to be found in John's Gospel, Jesus being tested by Satan. This passage is the first time in John's Gospel when Jesus will go face to face, eye to eye, with Satan. He goes right up against Satan because of the death of his friend Lazarus. This is the kind of work that Satan does, you see, and Jesus doesn't like it. He is filled with emotion to the point that he's shaking because he is going to knock Satan for a loop. And guess what? He does. He calls out and says, Lazarus, come out. And out comes Lazarus from the tomb. And then those powerful and beautiful words, untie him and let him go free. What's the point of the passage? Lazarus will die again. But when he dies the second time, Jesus will raise him up forever. He will never die again. Jesus would go on to Calvary, where he would lay down his life on the cross. And when he took his last breath, Satan was defeated definitively once and for all. Well, Father Jim, why do people die? The effects of evil remain, but its power to keep us in the ground forever is gone. It's destroyed. It's over. Satan got his rear end whooped by Jesus, to put it another way, as a redneck told me one time. That's what happened. That's the message of the story. That's the message of Easter. So what does this mean for us? You know, in this life, we experience darkness. We experience the effects of evil all the time. And one of the mistakes I used to make, and thank goodness for Father Marty Jinko, he showed me another way. We tend to blame that person who betrays us and sticks us in the back, sticks us royally in the back. We blame that person for their evil stuff. When we see a little 5-year-old boy named Joel die way before his time, we blame all kinds of things. The doctors didn't do enough. The medicine didn't work. You know, pollution in the environment. We blame all kinds of things. That's not what John's telling us in this gospel. When things happen in this life that are ugly and dark, it's simply a reflection of evil in the world. It's how evil works. And it can take some pretty good shots at us for sure. Many of us have had our hearts broken when someone we love dies before their time. When we are betrayed by someone that we put a lot of faith in this life. When things happen. You know, we think about the drug problems, the addicts in this life. Many times family gets so upset with the person who's addicted. But what about the evil behind it? You see, Jesus put his energy in the proper direction. He looked at Satan. And he didn't like the way he looked. And so he decided to defeat him. And he did. What this passage says for us, my brothers and sisters, that the worst that could happen to us in this life, the very worst, to be gone and dead forever, has been taken away. Jesus, in raising from the dead, gave us the promise of eternal life. And so it's important that we take this message to heart, because we can get overwhelmed by the effects of evil, but not with Jesus. He took it into his own hands and he defeated it forever. That our faith may be strengthened in Jesus, that when we encounter those dark times in life, may we realize that his power is there and alive for all of us.